A little girl warns Millionaire. She switched the contracts. He stops the merger last minute. Before we dive in, hit the like button if you believe kindness can change the world. Enjoy the story. The gleaming boardroom of Wyatt Financial buzzed with anticipation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline, where other deals worth millions were being struck in identical rooms. But this wasn't just any deal. This was Jake, Wyatt's moment of triumph. He adjusted his navy suit jacket, feeling the weight of success on his shoulders. At 31, he'd built a blockchain platform that revolutionized smart contracts. Today, he was merging with Pinnacle Corp, doubling his company's value and securing his place among the tech elite. "You look nervous," Jenna Banks whispered, her manicured hand finding his arm. At 32, she was everything Jake thought he wanted in a partner. Brilliant, ambitious, beautiful. As COO of Pinnacle Corp, she'd orchestrated this entire merger with the precision of a master chess player. Jake's mind wandered to the small voice that had been nagging at him all morning. Ava Collins, his girlfriend's 9-year-old stepdaughter, had been unusually quiet during breakfast. The little girl who usually chattered about everything from quantum physics to her favorite video games had barely touched her cereal. "Daddy Jake," she'd said, a title that still made his heart skip. "Can I see the contract again? The one with all the big words?" He'd laughed it off. What could a 9-year-old possibly understand about corporate mergers? Now, as reporters filled the room and camera lights flickered on, Jake wondered if he should have listened more carefully. Ava had a gift for seeing patterns others missed. It's what made her so good at coding, even at her age. But this was different. This was business. What happens when we ignore the smallest voices in the room? Sometimes they're the ones seeing everything clearly. 3 days earlier, Ava Collins sat cross-legged on the plush carpet of Jenna's home office, her iPad propped against a stack of legal documents that towered like a paper skyscraper. To most adults passing by, she looked like any other kid playing games on a tablet, lost in the colorful world of digital entertainment. But Ava wasn't playing. She was learning, absorbing, processing information with the hungry intensity of a sponge soaking up water. The office itself was a study in controlled elegance. Cream-colored walls adorned with expensive abstract art, a glass desk that seemed to float in space, and built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than functional. It was the kind of room that whispered success in hushed, expensive tones. "Practice makes perfect," Ava whispered to herself, repeating the mantra her late mother used to say whenever they tackled homework together. Reading legal documents had become Ava's way of feeling grown up, of preparing for a world that often seemed too big and complicated for someone who barely reached most adults' waists. Since her mother's death 18 months ago, words had become her sanctuary. While other kids her age were mastering TikTok dances or collecting Pokemon cards, Ava found comfort in the precise language of contracts, the mathematical certainty of financial statements, the logical flow of legal arguments. It was a way of keeping her mother's memory alive. Sarah Collins had been a paralegal before illness forced her into early retirement, and she'd always encouraged Ava's precocious interest in the law. The printer in the corner hummed to life with mechanical efficiency, spitting out page after page of dense text. The sound made Ava's eyes light up like Christmas morning. New reading material was always exciting, but legal documents were especially fascinating because they told stories. Stories about money and power, about who won and who lost in the great game of business. She crawled across the carpet with the fluid grace that only children possess, her knees making no sound on the thick Persian rug that probably cost more than most people's cars. The pages were still warm from the printer, carrying that distinct smell of fresh ink and possibility that Ava had learned to associate with important things happening. The header made her heart race with excitement. Confidential, merger agreement, final draft, Wyatt, Financial Pinnacle Corp. This was it, the mysterious document that had consumed so much of Jake and Jenna's attention over the past few weeks. This was different from the summary Jake had shown her the night before when she'd asked about his big business meeting. Different from the simplified explanation that made it sound like two friends deciding to share their toys. Ava settled back against the wall, her legs tucked beneath her in the lotus position she'd learned in the yoga classes. Jenna insisted she attend. The document was 47 pages long, she always counted, and filled with the kind of complex language that made most adults' eyes glaze over. But Ava had learned to navigate legal prose the way other kids learned to read maps in video games. She began to read with the methodical patience her mother had taught her finger tracing each line to maintain focus. Most of it was standard, boilerplate language, definitions, whereas clauses, representations, and warranties that were as predictable as sunrise. But Ava had learned to look for the important parts, the sections that contained actual substance beneath the legal verbosity, the parts with numbers, the parts that said who gets what when the music stops. Page after page, the document unfolded like a roadmap of corporate transformation. Section 2.1 detailed the exchange ratios, how many shares of the new combined company each current shareholder would receive. Section 3.4 outlined the management structure post-merger. Section 4.2 specified the board composition and voting procedures. But it was on page 15 that Ava's blue eyes narrowed with the intensity of a detective spotting a crucial clue. Section 4.7, Transfer of Voting Rights. Upon completion of merger, majority voting control, 51%, shall transfer to Pinnacle Corp management, specifically to be exercised by the Chief Operating Officer in consultation with the Board of Directors, with said authority including but not limited to decisions regarding strategic direction, major capital expenditures exceeding $500,000, executive compensation, and potential future acquisitions or divestitures. Ava read the paragraph 3 times, each reading making her more confused and increasingly worried. This wasn't what Jake had explained to her just yesterday when she'd asked him to tell her about the merger in kid language. He'd said it was a partnership that he and Jenna would share control equally, that it was like two kids combining their Lego sets to build something bigger and better together. But this document told a completely different story. This document said that after the merger, Pinnacle Corp, which meant Jenna, would control 51% of the combined company. That meant Jenna would have the power to outvote Jake on any major decision. That meant Jake wouldn't really be a partner at all. He'd be a minority owner in his own company. Ava's heart began to race the way it did when she found a particularly tricky bug in her coding projects. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. She grabbed her iPhone, the rose gold one Jake had given her for emergencies and staying in touch with family, and carefully photographed each page of the document. Her mother had taught her to always take pictures of important things, especially when they involved money or legal matters. Evidence, Sarah had called it during those long hospital stays when she was teaching Ava about the world's harsh realities. Always keep evidence, sweetheart. Grown-ups sometimes forget things when it's convenient for them to forget, but pictures don't lie. As Ava worked her way methodically through the document, photographing each page with the precision of a forensic investigator, she began to notice other troubling details. The signature authority clauses were different from what Jake had described. The termination provision seemed heavily weighted in Pinnacle's favor. Even the arbitration clause specified that any disputes would be resolved in Delaware, Pinnacle's home state, rather than New York where Wyatt Financial was headquartered. Separately, each clause might seem like minor legal technicalities. Together, they painted a picture that made Ava's stomach twist with anxiety. This wasn't a merger between equals. This was a takeover disguised as a partnership. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made Ava quickly stack the papers and return to her iPad, opening a coding game she'd been working on. The familiar interface of colorful blocks and logical sequences felt comforting after the disturbing complexity of the merger agreement. Jenna appeared in the doorway like a fashion magazine come to life, her cream-colored silk blouse perfectly pressed, her auburn hair styled in that effortless way that probably took an hour to achieve. Her smile was warm and practiced, the kind of expression that had probably charmed boardrooms full of executives and secured million-dollar deals. "What are you up to, sweetheart?" Jenna asked, her voice carrying that particular tone adults used when talking to children, simultaneously affectionate and slightly condescending. "Just reading," Ava replied, not looking up from her screen where she was arranging code blocks to make a digital cat dance across the display. The lie came easily, another skill she'd learned since her mother's death. Sometimes adults weren't ready to hear the truth, especially when the truth was complicated or inconvenient. Jenna's eyes darted to the printer, then to the scattered documents on her desk, then back to Ava with the quick, assessing gaze of someone who missed nothing. Something flickered across her perfectly made-up face, an expression too quick for most people to catch, gone almost before it appeared. But Ava caught it. She'd become an expert at reading adult faces since her mother got sick, learning to interpret the subtle signs that told her when grown-ups were worried, angry, or lying. And what she saw on Jenna's face in that split second made her blood run cold. Fear. Jenna was afraid. Not the kind of fear that comes from watching a scary movie or being startled by a loud noise. This was deeper, more calculating. This was the fear of someone who had secrets and was terrified they might be discovered. "Well, don't stay up here too long," Jenna said, her voice returning to its normal, cheerful register as if that moment of fear had never existed. "I'm making your favorite cookies downstairs. Chocolate chip with sea salt, just the way you like them." Ava nodded and smiled, playing her part in this elaborate game of pretense. But inside, her mind was racing with questions and connections, patterns and possibilities. She'd learned enough about business from her mother and from watching Jake work to understand that something wasn't right about this merger. The question was, what was she going to do about it? As Jenna's footsteps faded down the hallway, Ava looked at her phone, scrolling through the photographs she'd taken. 47 pages of evidence. 47 pages that told a story very different from the one Jake thought he was living. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the most important thing you can do is tell the truth even when it's scary, especially when it's scary." Ava took a deep breath and began composing a text message to the one adult she trusted to understand the gravity of what she'd discovered. Mr. Daniel Carson, Jake's retired lawyer, and the closest thing to a grandfather she had left in the world. Have you ever noticed how children see the truth adults try to hide? Their innocence becomes their superpower. Mr. Daniel Carson had seen enough corporate takeovers in his 40-year career to smell one from 3 city blocks away. At 66, the retired lawyer moved slowly, thanks to arthritis that reminded him daily of his advancing years, but his mind remained sharp as a surgical scalpel and twice as precise. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee in Jake's downtown office. But those tremors came from age, not uncertainty. When it came to legal matters, Daniel's instincts were as reliable as sunrise. The office that surrounded them was a testament to Jake's meteoric rise in the fintech world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's financial district, modern art that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, and technology so advanced it seemed borrowed from the future. But Daniel's focus wasn't on the trappings of success. It was on the young man sitting across from him, stress etched in every line of Jake's face like worry carved in marble. "This merger feels too smooth," Daniel said, settling his ancient bones into the leather chair that probably cost more than his first car. His gray eyes, magnified behind wire-rimmed glasses that had seen decades of legal battles, studied Jake with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "In 40 years of practice, I've learned that when everyone's happy in a business deal, someone's lying, usually to themselves." Jake looked up from his laptop, exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his fingers through it. The young entrepreneur, who'd once radiated confidence, now seemed diminished, uncertain, like a man standing on quicksand disguised as solid ground. "Daniel, I appreciate the concern, truly I do," Jake said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd been having the same conversation in his head for weeks. "But Jenna's team has been transparent about everything. We've reviewed the documents a dozen times. Her lawyers, my lawyers, the accountants, the consultants. Everyone says this is the deal of the century." "Have you?" Daniel's question cut through the corporate optimism like a knife through silk. "Every page? Every clause, every signature, every footnote and addendum and rider. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his ergonomic chair, the kind of movement that told Daniel everything he needed to know about the answer. Truth was, Jake had skimmed most of the merger documents, not out of laziness or arrogance, but because Jenna had walked him through the highlights with such confidence and clarity that deeper scrutiny seemed unnecessary. Her lawyer, Mark Dillon, had assured him everything was standard boilerplate, the kind of legal language that looked complicated, but was really just fancy ways of saying simple things. Mark Dillon, Daniel repeated slowly when Jake mentioned the name, rolling it around on his tongue like a wine taster detecting something unpleasant. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips and something shifted in his expression. A subtle hardening that spoke of old battles and bitter memories. You know the name? Jake asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. Daniel's laugh held no humor whatsoever, more like the sound a snake might make if snakes could express irony. Tall fellow? Slicked back hair that looks like it was styled with motor oil? Talks fast and blinks too much when he's nervous. Has a habit of adjusting his tie when he's about to lie? That's actually a pretty accurate description. How do you... I sued him 8 years ago, Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of old grievances and hard-won victories. Caught him forging signatures on real estate contracts, creating fake documentation for property transfers. That didn't legally exist. Cost his clients $3 million before we caught him. He lost his license for 2 years and spent 18 months doing community service. The information hit Jake like cold water thrown in his face. He set down his coffee cup with shaking hands, the expensive porcelain making a sharp sound against the glass desk. Daniel leaned forward, his weathered face serious as a funeral. Jake, I'm not saying don't trust. Trust is what makes business possible, what separates civilization from chaos. But I am saying verify. Everything. Every single detail, every clause, every signature, every assumption. Jake's phone buzzed against the glass desk, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden tension of the moment. A text message from Jenna lit up the screen. Can't wait for tomorrow. This will change everything for us. The heart and champagne emojis should have filled Jake with warmth and excitement. Instead, they made something cold and unpleasant settle in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The phrase change everything suddenly sounded less like a promise and more like a threat. Something was wrong. Jake couldn't articulate exactly what or why, but every instinct he'd developed in 5 years of building a business was screaming warnings that he'd been ignoring for weeks. It was like having a fire alarm going off while everyone around you insisted there was no smoke. He thought about Ava's quiet behavior over the past few days, her unusually intense interest in the merger documents, the careful way she'd been choosing, her words. He thought about Daniel's warnings, about Mark Dillon's suspicious past, about the way Jenna's explanations always seemed to glide over the complex details in favor of reassuring generalities. What would you do? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. If you were me, what would you do? Daniel stood slowly, his joints protesting with the soft sounds of advancing age. He walked to the window and looked out at the Manhattan skyline, where countless other dramas of money and power were playing out behind glass walls and steel facades. I'd ask someone to read every word of that contract, he said finally. Someone without skin in the game. Someone who sees things differently than we do. Someone who hasn't learned to rationalize away red flags for the sake of convenience or politeness. Like who? Jake asked, though something in his heart already knew the answer. Daniel turned from the window, a slight smile creasing his weathered face like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, like that little girl of yours. I've watched her during our family dinners, seen her during business meetings when she's quietly reading in the corner. She notices everything, processes everything, remembers everything. Children haven't learned to lie to themselves yet. Jake shook his head reflexively. She's 9 years old, Daniel, 9. She plays with coding apps and asks for extra bedtime stories. Exactly, Daniel said, his smile widening. She's 9 years old, which means she hasn't learned to ignore inconvenient truths. She hasn't developed the sophisticated capacity for self-deception that allows adults to overlook obvious problems. She reads everything because she finds it genuinely interesting, not because she's looking for what she wants to find. The old lawyer moved back to his chair, settling in with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to accommodate an aging body. Jake, I've been practicing law since before you were born. I've seen brilliant attorneys miss obvious flaws in contracts because they were too invested in making the deal work. I've seen successful businessmen destroy their own companies because they trusted the wrong people for the right reasons. But surely you don't think— I don't think anything, Daniel interrupted gently. I'm suggesting you find out. And sometimes, the best way to see clearly is to ask someone who's looking at the situation with completely fresh eyes. Jake stared at his phone, at Jenna's message with its cheerful emojis and promises of transformation. The office felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in with the weight of decisions made and consequences yet to unfold. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its relentless dance of ambition and acquisition. Deals struck and fortunes made and lost in the time it took to sign a name on a legal document. But inside this room, a young entrepreneur was beginning to realize that his greatest challenge wasn't building a company, or impressing investors, or conquering markets. It was learning to trust the voice of a 9-year-old girl who might be the only person in his life telling him the truth. Sometimes wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. Who in your life sees things others miss? The signing ceremony was scheduled for noon, but by 10:30 Jake's hands were shaking like autumn leaves in a winter wind. He stood in the executive bathroom of the Pinnacle Corp building, a monument to corporate success with its marble countertops and gold-plated fixtures, splashing cold water on his face in a desperate attempt to wash away the doubt that clung to him like morning fog that refused to lift. His reflection stared back at him from the ornate mirror. A successful young entrepreneur worth $50 million who looked like he was about to throw up from sheer anxiety. The navy Armani suit that had felt like armor that morning now seemed like a costume, as if he were playing a role he no longer understood in a play whose script had been changed, without his knowledge. The ride over in his Tesla had been an exercise in barely controlled panic. Ava had been unusually quiet during the 20-minute drive through Manhattan traffic, sitting in the back seat clutching her phone and staring out the window at the towering glass monuments to capitalism that defined the city's financial district. Her silence was more unnerving than any tantrum could have been. "Daddy Jake?" she'd said as they pulled into the underground parking garage, her voice carrying that particular quality children's voices have when they're about to ask something important. "Yes, sweetheart," he'd replied, trying to keep his own voice steady, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "If someone you love does something bad, are you supposed to tell on them?" The question had hit him like a physical blow, stopping his breath in his chest and making his hands grip the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Children's questions always cut straight to the heart of things adults spent years dancing around, slicing through complexity and rationalization to expose the raw truth underneath. "That depends," he'd said carefully, his lawyer's training kicking in even as his paternal instincts screamed warnings. "What kind of bad thing?" Ava had been quiet for a long moment, her blue eyes reflecting the artificial lights of the parking garage. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind that hurts other people." Now, as Jake dried his face with a paper towel that probably cost more than most people spent on lunch, those words echoed in his mind like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. Ava knew something. The way she'd been acting over the past few days, the careful way she chose her words, the photographs she'd been taking when she thought no one was looking. She knew something that was tearing her apart inside. His phone rang with the sharp insistence of technology demanding attention. Jenna's name lit up the screen along with her contact photo, a professional headshot that captured her beauty and intelligence in equal measure, the kind of image that belonged on magazine covers or corporate websites. "Baby, where are you?" Her voice carried through the speaker with that slight breathlessness that had once charmed him, but now sounded almost manufactured. "Everyone's asking for you. The reporters are getting restless and the investors are starting to check their watches." "Just needed a minute," Jake said, hearing the uncertainty in his own voice like a man listening to a stranger speak with his mouth. "Jake?" Jenna's tone shifted, becoming softer, more intimate, the voice she used late at night when they talked about their future together. I know this is scary. Big changes always are. Moving to the next level, combining our lives and our businesses, it's natural to feel overwhelmed. She paused, and Jake could hear the ambient noise of the conference room in the background, conversations and camera equipment and the subtle hum of important people doing important things. But think about what we're building together. She continued, her voice warm with promise and possibility. Think about our future. The company we'll create, the life we'll have, the family we'll be. This is just the beginning, Jake. The beginning of everything we've dreamed about. Our future. The words should have filled him with warmth and excitement, should have banished his doubts like sunrise burning away darkness. Instead, they made his skin crawl with an unpleasant sensation he couldn't quite identify. There was something in the way she said our future that sounded less like sharing and more like claiming. Jenna, can I ask you something? Jake said, his voice carrying a note of desperation he couldn't quite suppress. Of course, baby. Anything. The voting rights clause in Section 4.7. The silence that followed was so complete Jake wondered if the call had been dropped. When Jenna spoke again, her voice had changed subtly, carrying an edge of impatience carefully disguised as concern. Jake, honey, we've been through this. The endearment sounded forced now, like sugar sprinkled over something bitter. It's just legal language, technical specifications that don't change anything between us. You know I would never do anything to hurt you or undermine what we've built together. But something in her voice had shifted like tectonic plates moving, beneath the surface of politeness. A tightness, a defensiveness, the sound of someone who'd been asked a question they'd hoped to avoid. I'd like to review it one more time, Jake said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Just to make sure I understand exactly what... Jake. The warmth was completely gone from her voice now, replaced by something that sounded almost like a warning. There are 200 people waiting in that conference room. The media is here. Our investors, our partners, our lawyers, everyone who matters in our industry is watching this moment. You can't just... I can't just what? The words exploded from Jake's mouth with surprising force. Be careful with my own company? Make sure I understand what I'm signing? Take responsibility for a decision that will affect the rest of my life? Another silence. This one even more complete than the first. When Jenna spoke again, her voice was cold as January wind. Don't be difficult about this, Jake. The line went, dead with the finality of a door slamming shut. Jake stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing a stranger looking back at him, 31 years old, worth $50 million, founder of a company that had revolutionized an entire industry. And he felt like a child who'd just realized the adults around him had been lying about something fundamental. The woman he'd been planning to propose to after the merger signing had just revealed something ugly beneath her polished exterior. The business deal he'd thought was a partnership had started to look like something else entirely. And the 9-year-old girl who'd been trying to warn him was the only person in his life who seemed to be telling him the truth. Jake took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and prepared to walk into a room full of people who were about to discover that sometimes the most important moments in business have nothing to do with contracts or signatures or corporate strategy. Sometimes they're about having the courage to listen when someone you trust tries to save you from yourself. Trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. The signing ceremony had transformed Pinnacle Corp's main conference room into a theater of corporate power and ambition. Camera crews positioned their equipment with military precision while reporters checked their notes and tested their microphones. Important-looking people in expensive suits filled every available chair, their conversations creating a buzz of anticipation that felt electric with possibility and expectation. The room itself was designed to intimidate and impress, a soaring ceiling with exposed steel beams, walls of glass that offered panoramic views of Manhattan's financial district, and a conference table so large it could have served as a landing strip for small aircraft. Everything about the space whispered of serious money and serious people doing serious things. Jake entered to polite applause that seemed to echo off the walls like thunder, but his eyes weren't focused on the sea of faces turned toward him with expectant smiles. Instead, he searched the crowd for two people whose presence mattered more than all the investors and reporters combined. There, in the back corner, like guardian angels watching over the proceedings, sat Mr. Daniel with Ava beside him. The little girl wore her best dress, the navy blue one with tiny silver buttons that matched her eyes, but her face was pale with worry and something that looked suspiciously like determination. She clutched her phone in both hands like a talisman, her knuckles white with the intensity of her grip. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark Dillon's voice boomed through the wireless microphone system, his words carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in rooms full of powerful people. Today marks a historic moment. In fintech innovation, the joining of two visionary companies that will reshape how the world thinks about digital contracts and blockchain technology. Jake barely heard the words, his focus entirely consumed by the scene unfolding in the back corner. Ava was whispering urgently to Mr. Daniel while showing him something on her phone, her small finger pointing to details on the screen with the precision of a forensic investigator. The old lawyer's eyebrows rose higher with each word she spoke, his expression shifting from mild interest to serious concern, to something that looked like barely controlled outrage. The merger of Wyatt Financial and Pinnacle Corp represents more than just a business transaction, Mark continued, his voice filled with the kind of enthusiasm that sounded rehearsed. It represents the future of financial technology, the marriage of innovation and execution that will create value for shareholders, employees, and customers alike. Jake? Jenna's hand touched his arm with the light pressure of someone seeking to regain lost attention. She looked every inch the successful executive in her tailored black suit and understated jewelry, her auburn hair styled in that effortless way that probably required an hour of professional attention. They're ready for you. But Jake wasn't ready for them. As he looked at Jenna, really looked at her, he felt like he was seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. The woman he'd fallen in love with, the partner he'd trusted with his future, had been replaced by someone whose smile never quite reached her eyes and whose every gesture seemed calculated for maximum effect. "Before we sign," Jake said, his voice carrying across the room with surprising strength, "I'd like to review the final terms one more time." The words fell into the corporate atmosphere like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion and concern that spread through the assembled crowd. A murmur of whispered conversations began to build, the kind of noise that happens when people suddenly realize they might be witnessing something more dramatic than they'd expected. Mark Dillon's practiced smile faltered like a mask slipping sideways. "Jake, we've reviewed everything extensively. The terms are exactly as we discussed, exactly as your legal team approved." "Have they?" Jake stepped away from Jenna, putting physical distance between himself and the woman who'd promised to share his future. "Because I'm starting to wonder if everyone's been reading the same document." That's when Ava stood up. The 9-year-old girl rose from her chair in the back corner, like a small blonde beacon of truth, her navy dress making her look even younger and more vulnerable against the backdrop of corporate power surrounding her. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she began walking toward the front, her phone clutched in her small hands like evidence in a trial. The reporters sensed drama and began adjusting their cameras. The investors leaned forward in their seats. The lawyers reached for their phones, no doubt preparing to call their offices with updates about a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's control. "Daddy Jake," Ava said, her clear voice cutting through the corporate noise like a bell ringing in a cathedral. "I need to show you something." Her words carried the kind of absolute certainty that only children possess, the unwavering conviction of someone who hasn't learned to doubt herself or second-guess her perceptions. In a room full of adults who'd spent their careers learning to hedge their bets and qualify their statements, her directness was like lightning striking clear ground. Jenna's face went white as winter snow. "Ava, sweetie, this isn't the place." "Yes, it is." Ava's blue eyes blazed with the intensity of someone who'd found her courage and refused to let it go. It's exactly the place. She held up her iPhone, the rose gold surface catching the lights. From the camera crews as she displayed the photograph she'd taken 3 days earlier, the room fell silent with the kind of complete attention that usually preceded either revelation or disaster. Section 4.7, Transfer of Voting Rights. Ava began to read in her clear, innocent voice that somehow carried to every corner of the room. Upon completion of merger, majority voting control, 51%, shall transfer to Pinnacle Corp management. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Jake felt the ground shift beneath his feet as if the building's foundation had suddenly become uncertain. The partnership he'd believed in, the equal merger he'd been promised, was revealed to be something else entirely. "That's not what you told me," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone in the suddenly silent room. Jenna's composure began to crack like ice under pressure. "Jake, please. Ava doesn't understand business terminology. She's taking things out of context. She understands numbers." Mr. Daniels' weathered voice rang out as he joined them at the front of the room, his age-spotted hands steady as he opened a folder he'd been carrying. "And she understands when adults are lying." The old lawyer's words fell into the corporate silence like bombs detonating in slow motion. Around the room, reporters began scribbling notes furiously while camera operators zoomed in on the unfolding drama. This wasn't the smooth corporate merger they'd expected to cover. This was something far more interesting. And in the center of it all stood a 9-year-old girl whose love of reading was about to save a fortune and expose a conspiracy that had been months in the making. Children have a way of revealing truth that adults have learned to hide from. Listen to the voices others ignore. The conference room erupted in whispers that grew louder with each passing second, like a storm gathering strength over open water. Camera operators swung their equipment toward the unfolding drama, while reporters frantically scribbled notes, their usual professional composure cracking as they realized they were witnessing something far more explosive than a routine corporate merger. The financial journalists who'd expected to file predictable stories about market consolidation and synergistic value creation were now scrambling to capture every detail of what was rapidly becoming the business scandal of the year. Phone cameras emerged from pockets and purses as people began documenting a moment that would be dissected in boardrooms and business schools for years to come. Jenna Banks stood frozen at the front of the room, feeling 32 years of careful planning and meticulous manipulation crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. She'd worked too hard, invested too much time and energy, sacrificed too many pieces of her soul to let a 9-year-old girl with an inconvenient gift for reading destroy everything she'd built. The mask of professional competence and romantic devotion that she'd worn for months was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of something calculating and cold underneath. But Jenna had spent her entire career learning to perform under pressure, to maintain composure when everything was falling apart. If she could just regain control of the narrative, redirect attention away from Ava's damaging revelations, she might still salvage this situation. "Jake, please," she said, summoning tears that appeared on cue with the practiced precision of a skilled actress. Her voice trembled with just the right amount of vulnerability, a performance honed through years of manipulating powerful men who thought they were too smart to be deceived. "You're embarrassing me in front of everyone. This is supposed to be our special day, the beginning of our future together." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like perfume designed to mask an unpleasant odor. Several of the older investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their natural instinct to protect successful women in business conflicting with their growing suspicion that something wasn't right about this entire situation. "Ava is just upset because she doesn't want a new mother," Jenna continued, her voice gaining strength as she fell into the familiar rhythm of emotional manipulation. "Children act out when they feel threatened by change. She's trying to sabotage our relationship because she's scared of losing you." The explanation sounded reasonable enough to several people in the room who had limited experience with children, and even less understanding of how a 9-year-old mind actually worked. But Jake knew Ava better than that. He'd watched her navigate the loss of her mother with remarkable grace and maturity. He'd seen her welcome him into her life with open arms and genuine affection. Ava wasn't acting out. She was trying to save him. Don't. Jake's voice cut through Jenna's performance like a sword through silk, sharp enough to make several people in the room flinch. Don't you dare use her feelings against her. Don't you dare suggest that a child who lost her mother and welcomed me into her life is somehow sabotaging anything. But doubt flickered across Jake's face like shadows cast by passing clouds, and Jenna saw it with the predatory instincts of someone who'd built her career on reading people and exploiting their weaknesses. She pressed her advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a chess master who'd spotted a path to victory. "Sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to Ava's eye level with fluid grace, her expensive suit somehow remaining perfectly pressed despite the movement. Her voice became soft and maternal, the tone she'd practiced for months while learning to play the role of caring stepmother. "I know this is scary. Change is always hard, especially for someone who's already lost so much." Ava stared at her with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth underneath. For a moment, Jenna felt genuinely unnerved by the intensity of that gaze, as if a child were somehow looking directly into her soul and finding it wanting. "But Daddy Jake and I love each other," Jenna continued, her voice warm with manufactured sincerity. "We want to build something beautiful together, a family, a future. We want to take care of you and give you everything you could ever want or need." The words hung in the air like honey-coated poison, sweet on the surface, but toxic underneath. Several people in the room nodded unconsciously, their natural sympathy for family drama overriding their business instincts. But Ava didn't flinch. She didn't cry or run or retreat into the kind of emotional response that might have validated Jenna's narrative. Instead, she stood perfectly still and spoke with the kind of devastating clarity that only comes from complete certainty. "You don't love him. You love his company." The words fell into the corporate silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through the assembled crowd with increasing intensity. It was a statement so simple, so direct, and so obviously true that it hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Mark Dillon stepped forward with the instinctive urgency of a lawyer trying to prevent his client from saying something incriminating. His usually confident demeanor was starting to crack around the edges like expensive paint exposed to harsh weather. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying forced authority that fooled no one, "perhaps we should take a brief recess. Emotions are running high, and family matters shouldn't be resolved in public forums. This is, after all, supposed to be a business meeting." "No." Mr. Daniels' weathered voice commanded attention with the kind of absolute authority that comes from decades of courtroom battles and hard-won victories. "No recess, no delays, no attempts to sweep this under the rug or handle it behind closed doors." The old lawyer opened his briefcase with deliberate precision, his age-spotted hands steady despite the tremor that usually affected them. He'd spent the previous night reviewing every document Ava had photographed, comparing them line by line with the original merger agreements Jake had shown him weeks earlier. "Jake, look at these documents," Daniel said, spreading papers across the polished conference table like evidence in a murder trial. "Really look at them, not the summaries or the explanations or the reassurances. Look at the actual words on the actual pages." The papers seemed to glow under the conference room lights, 47 pages of legal language that told a story very different from the one Jake thought he'd been living. Daniel's voice carried the weight of 40 years of legal experience as he began to dissect the deception with surgical precision. "The voting rights clause has been changed from equal partnership to majority control by Pinnacle Corp," he said, his finger tracing the relevant text. "The signature authority has been transferred from joint decision-making to unilateral power exercised by Pinnacle's chief operating officer." Jake's hands shook as he examined the documents, his face growing paler with each revelation. The merger he'd believed would secure his future was actually designed to steal it. "Even the arbitration clause has been modified," Daniel continued relentlessly.
"Any disputes will be resolved in Delaware under Delaware law, using arbitrators selected by a panel controlled by Pinnacle Corp. You wouldn't just be signing away your company, Jake. You'd be signing away any legal recourse to get it back." Every
Change was subtle but devastating. Separately, they might seem like minor legal adjustments, the kind of technical modifications that lawyers made all the time. Together, they constituted a complete takeover disguised as a partnership. "There's more," Daniel said, his gray eyes hard as steel behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "The audit certification signature? It belongs to a firm that went out of business 6 months ago. The letterhead is fake. The seal is forged. The entire document is fraudulent." All eyes turned to Mark Dillon, whose confident demeanor was melting, like snow in sunshine. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume, his slicked-back hair like a disguise that was no longer fooling anyone. That's just an administrative error," he stammered, his voice lacking any of its earlier authority. "Sometimes these things get mixed up in the document preparation process. It doesn't mean anything significant, doesn't it?" Daniel's voice carried the cold fury of someone who'd spent his career fighting corruption and had no patience for lies. "Because I called the state certification board this morning. I spoke to 3 different officials who confirmed that this signature is identical to the forged signatures you used in the Hartwell real estate case 8 years ago." The revelation hit the room like lightning striking a tree, illuminating everything, in stark detail for one brilliant moment before the thunder followed. The Hartwell case had been major news in legal circles, a complex real estate fraud that had cost investors millions and sent several people to prison. "The same case that cost you your license for 2 years," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The same case where you were convicted of document fraud and served 18 months of community service. The same case that should have ended your legal career permanently." Mark Dillon's face went from pale to gray to an unhealthy shade of green. Several investors were already reaching for their phones, no doubt calling their legal teams to discuss potential criminal liability for participating in what was clearly a fraudulent transaction. The room was dead silent except for the mechanical whir of camera equipment and the soft scratching of reporters' pens against paper. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped working, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Jenna's face had gone from confident to concerned to something approaching panic. The tears were gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that had been hiding behind her mask of feminine vulnerability. When she spoke again, her voice was stripped of its earlier warmth. "You have no proof of anything intentional," she said, her words carrying the sharp edge of someone who'd been backed into a corner but wasn't ready to surrender. "Mistakes happen in complex legal transactions. Document errors occur. These things can be corrected." But Ava stepped forward, still clutching her phone like a sword of truth in a room full of lies. Her small voice carried across the corporate silence with devastating clarity. "I have proof. The truth always finds a way to surface. Sometimes it just needs the right person to bring it into the light." The next few minutes unfolded like a scene from a legal thriller, except the star witness was a 9-year-old girl with curly blonde hair and an eye for detail that would make seasoned investigators jealous. Ava's small fingers moved across her phone screen with practiced precision. "I didn't just take pictures of the contract," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of every adult eye upon her. "I recorded conversations too." Jenna's face went from ashen to gray. "Ava, you can't—" "Mommy taught me to always keep evidence," Ava continued. She said grown-ups sometimes forget the truth. The little girl connected her phone to the room's presentation system, a trick Jake had taught her weeks earlier when she'd wanted to show him her coding projects. Her voice filled the room, crystal clear through the speakers. "This is from 3 days ago when Miss Jenna was talking to Mr. Mark on the phone." Jenna's voice crackled through the speakers. "Is everything in place? The contract changes?" Mark's reply was equally clear. "All set. Wyatt will never know what hit him. By the time he figures out we've taken control, it'll be too late to reverse." "Good. I've spent months making him trust me. The fool actually thinks I love him." The recorded laughter that followed was like breaking glass. Jake felt something die, inside his chest. Not just love, that had been fading for days, but his faith in his own judgment, his belief that he could read people, his confidence in the decisions that had built his empire. Around the room, Investors and reporters shifted. Uncomfortably, several people were already reaching for their phones, no doubt calling their legal teams or editors, but Ava wasn't finished. "There's more," she said quietly. "From yesterday." Mark's voice filled the room again. "The audit signature is perfect. No one will question it until after the merger is complete. By then, Pinnacle will control 51% of Wyatt Financial, and there's nothing he can do about it." Jenna's response chilled the room. "Jake is too emotional, too trusting. Men like him deserve what they get." The recording ended, leaving behind a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like thunder. Jake looked at Jenna, really looked at her, and saw a complete stranger. The woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, his future plans was nothing more than an elaborate lie. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna straightened, her mask finally completely gone. "How long what?" "How long have you been planning this?" Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Since the day I met you, Jake. You were so eager to be loved, so desperate to trust someone. It was almost too easy. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those closest to us. But truth has a way of exposing lies when we're brave enough to listen." The aftermath unfolded like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Mark Dillon was escorted from the building by security, while frantically making phone calls to lawyers who probably wouldn't take his calls. Several investors were already discussing legal action. The media had their story of the year, but in the chaos of collapsed schemes and corporate drama, Jake only had eyes for one person. Ava stood beside Mr. Daniel, looking smaller than ever in her blue dress, but with a dignity that seemed to fill the entire room. She'd just saved his company, his fortune, his future, and she looked like she was about to cry. Jake knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see the fear beneath her brave exterior. She was, after all, just a 9-year-old girl who'd had to expose the woman who was supposed to become her stepmother. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Ava's lower lip trembled. "Are you mad at me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "Mad? Ava, you saved everything. I should have listened to you days ago. But now Miss Jenna won't be my mommy anymore." Jake felt his heart break for this little girl who'd lost her mother, found a father figure in him, and now had to watch another mother figure reveal herself as a lie. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "Jenna was never going to be your real mother. Real mothers protect their children. They don't use them. But what if you don't want me anymore, now that she's gone?" The fear in her voice told the whole story. Ava hadn't just been protecting Jake's company, she'd been risking the only family she had left. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It wasn't the engagement ring he'd planned to give Jenna. It was something far more precious. A delicate silver bracelet that had belonged to Ava's mother. "Your mom gave this to me before she died," he said, fastening it around Ava's thin wrist. "She made me promise to give it to you when you were old enough to understand what family really means." Ava looked down at the bracelet, then up at Jake, with those impossibly blue eyes. "Family means telling the truth even when it's scary," she said. "Especially when it's scary," Jake agreed. Mr. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "If I may," the old lawyer said, "I think this young lady has earned herself a permanent position as chief ethics officer." Ava giggled, the first genuinely happy sound she'd made in days. "Do I get a salary?" "You get something better," Jake said, pulling her into a hug. "You get a father who will never, ever stop listening to you. Family isn't just about blood or marriage certificates, it's about people who choose to protect and believe in each other." 6 months later, the corner booth at Rossetti's Deli had become their sacred space, a weekly ritual that anchored their transformed lives in the simple pleasure of shared meals and honest conversation. Every Sunday at exactly 1 o'clock, Jake, Ava, and Mr. Daniel would meet for lunch in what they'd started calling their weekly board meeting. Part business discussion, part family time, and entirely genuine. The deli itself was nothing fancy, just a neighborhood institution that had been serving the same families for 3 generations. Red checkered tablecloths, black and white photos of old New York on the walls, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that no amount of money could manufacture. It was exactly the kind of place where real relationships were built over pastrami sandwiches and honest conversation. Today, Ava was explaining her latest coding project between enthusiastic bites of her grilled cheese sandwich, her blue eyes bright with the excitement that came from solving complex problems and creating something new. At 9 years old, she was already building applications that made Jake's blockchain platform more user-friendly, translating complex financial technology into interfaces that ordinary people could understand and trust. And then I added a feature that highlights any contract changes in red, she said, her small hands gesturing expressively as she described her work. Like, if someone tries to change important numbers or voting rights or signature authority, the whole section turns red so nobody can miss it. Mr. Daniel chuckled, the sound warm with affection and admiration as he spread mustard on his pastrami sandwich, with hands that shook slightly, but remained remarkably steady when it came to the important things. Trust a child to solve in code what lawyers have been fighting about for centuries. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most elegant. Jake smiled, watching his daughter, because that's exactly what she was now, officially and completely, navigate between her tablet and her lunch, with the same methodical precision she applied to everything from homework to high-stakes business analysis. The adoption papers had been finalized 3 weeks ago, making legal what had been true in their hearts for months. Ava Collins was now Ava Collins Wyatt, and Jake had never been prouder of any signature in his entire life. The ceremony had been small and private, just the three of them and a family court judge who'd remarked that she'd never seen a child more excited about the legal process of adoption. "Daddy Jake," Ava said, looking up from her tablet with the slightly mischievous expression that usually preceded her most brilliant ideas. "I've been thinking about the company slogan." Wyatt Financial had been rebuilding its reputation slowly but surely since the merger scandal. The media attention from the failed Pinnacle Corp deal had actually brought in new clients, small businesses and individual investors who valued a company that chose ethics over profit, that had proven it would rather lose a deal than compromise its principles. The publicity had been intense but ultimately positive. Stories about the 9-year-old girl who'd saved a $50 million company from corporate theft had captured the public imagination, leading to speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, and a level of trust that most financial firms spent decades trying to build. "What about the slogan?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about what his daughter's remarkable mind had produced. Ava turned her tablet around with a flourish, showing him a mock-up of their company website, with new text displayed prominently across the top of the home page. "We sign with integrity, powered by truth." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion as he read the words. The slogan captured everything they'd learned about business, about relationships, about the kind of company they wanted to be in a world where trust was the most valuable currency of all. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with pride and love. "Actually," Ava said with a grin that reminded him so powerfully of her mother that it took his breath away, "I was thinking it should say, powered by Ava. You know, for accuracy." Mr. Daniel burst into laughter, nearly choking on his coffee as the joke hit him with unexpected force. "Now that would be truth in advertising if I've ever heard it, though I suspect your father might have some concerns about the marketing implications." Jake reached across the table and took Ava's small hand in his, feeling the weight of the silver bracelet that had once belonged to her mother. The jewelry seemed to catch the afternoon sunlight streaming through the deli windows, creating small rainbows that danced across their table like promises of better days ahead. "You know what I've learned over these past 6 months?" he said, his voice carrying the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and discovering what truly matters. "What?" Ava asked, her attention completely focused on him in the way that only children possess, absolute presence without distraction or judgment. "Sometimes the most important business advice comes from someone who can't even see over the conference table," Jake said. "Sometimes the person with the clearest vision is the one everyone else thinks is too young to understand what's really happening." Ava squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. "That's because we're not tall enough to miss what's right in front of us." The wisdom in her words hit Jake like a revelation. Adults spent so much time looking over and around problems, searching for complex solutions to simple questions, that they often missed the obvious answers right in front of them. Children saw clearly because they hadn't yet learned to doubt their own perceptions or rationalize away inconvenient truths. Outside the deli windows, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy of ambition and acquisition. Deals were being struck in glass towers, fortunes were being made and lost in the time it took to send an email, and somewhere in the city, other 9-year-olds were probably seeing truths that the adults around them had learned to ignore. But in their corner booth, surrounded by the comfortable noise of families sharing Sunday lunch, a millionaire entrepreneur, a retired lawyer with 4 decades of legal wisdom, and a little girl with an extraordinary gift for truth had created something rarer than any successful merger or profitable acquisition. They'd created a family built on honesty, trust, and the revolutionary idea that the smallest voice in the room might be the one everyone most needs to hear. They'd learned that success wasn't just about building companies or accumulating wealth. It was about having people in your life who cared enough about you to tell you the truth, even when that truth was scary or inconvenient or threatened everything you thought you wanted. As they sat together in the warm afternoon light, planning next week's projects and sharing stories about their day, Jake realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not a business partner or a romantic relationship or a path to greater success, but a family that chose to protect each other through honesty, courage, and unconditional love. And at the center of it all was a 9-year-old girl whose refusal to let adults lie to themselves had saved them all from devastating betrayal, proving once and for all that wisdom often comes in the smallest packages, and the most important truths are usually the simplest ones. The most profound wisdom, often, comes from the most unexpected sources. Who in your life have you been overlooking? What truth might they be trying to tell you that you haven't been ready to hear? Sometimes we need to get down to a child's eye level to see clearly again, to remember that the most important questions have simple answers if we're brave enough to listen. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that truth and family are worth more than any deal or dream of success. Like this video if you believe in the power of listening to the voices others ignore, and subscribe to hear more stories about courage, truth, and the extraordinary wisdom that lives in ordinary moments. Because sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the one that can save everything we hold dear.